So here is something that should not have been possible. A woman wrote a letter about her two sons. She wrote it in the summer of 1993, 4 years before she died. And she wrote it in her own hand. That letter reached the people it was addressed to. It was read. It was answered. And then it went into a box, and those two boys grew up and got married and had children of their own, and nobody ever showed it to either of them. 27 years. Now I am going to hold what was in that letter for a while, because it only hits properly once you know who had it, who read it, and whose initials ended up on the form that kept it closed. Stay with me on this one. It turns 4 separate times, and the third turn is the one that finished a career. If you like the ones where a single piece of paper takes somebody apart, take a second and subscribe, because that is exactly what happened here. Quick word before we go further. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through the wills, the schedules, the conservation reports, and the small print that moves around this family. The documents that get filed correctly and forgotten on purpose. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me to the end, because the last document in this story was published by the palace itself, in a routine return, by accident. By the time we finish, you will know what Diana asked for. You will know who she asked. You will know why the answer never reached her children. And you will know exactly what was signed in 2005 and by which office. Let me start with the part that is real, checkable, and almost nobody knows, because everything after it grows out of it. Diana made a will on the 1st of June 1993. She amended it with a codicil in 1996. That document is public. Anybody watching this can find it in about 90 seconds and read the whole thing. And on the 2nd of June 1993, the day after she signed that will, she wrote something else. A letter of wishes. Let me explain what that is, because it takes 20 seconds and everything in this story hangs off it. A will is an instruction, and it has to be obeyed. A letter of wishes sits beside it and says how the person wants things handled in practice, the parts that are too personal or too detailed to put into legal wording. The person who should have a particular object. The thing that should be done first, the parts that matter. The consequence is the part that matters, and it is brutal. A will binds the people who administer it. A letter of wishes does not. It carries whatever weight the executors decide to give it. Diana wrote hers in her own words, and she used the words a person uses when they are talking about their family rather than talking to a lawyer. She used the word wishes. She used the word discretion. Those 2 words are the reason the rest of this story exists. Because after she died, her executors, who were her own mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and her own sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, went to court and asked for a variation of the arrangements. And the court granted it. 2 things changed. The first is the one people occasionally know about. Her will left a quarter of her personal chattels to her 17 godchildren, which at the valuations of the time would have been somewhere around £100,000 of property each. After the variation, each godchild received 1 item, 1. Several of them have described what they got in terms considerably less polite than I am going to use here. The second change is the one almost nobody knows, and it is the one that matters for tonight. Her sons were to receive the estate at 25. After the variation, that became 30. William was 15 when his mother died. That decision took 5 years of his adult life and moved them, and the remainder of that estate did not reach Harry until the 15th of September 2014, which is the day he turned 30. And the reason the court permitted the letter of wishes to be set aside is written into the ruling in plain language. The document was not binding because of the words she had chosen. Sit with that for a second, because I want to be sure it lands. A woman sat down the day after signing her will and wrote out what she wanted for her children in her own handwriting, and the legal system looked at her wording and decided that she had expressed a hope rather than given an order. She was 32 years old when she wrote it. She had 4 years left. Now, that is the real part. All of it is on the record and all of it happened. Here is where this story starts, and it starts with a second document that was written on the same desk, in the same week. and which never went anywhere near a court. Because a letter of wishes is not the only thing a person writes when they are putting their affairs in order and they are frightened. Diana wrote a covering letter, and that one was not addressed to a solicitor. Nobody went looking for it. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the reason it took 27 years. The work going on in the spring of that year had nothing to do with Diana at all. The household had begun a conservation program across a run of private archives, the kind of exercise that gets done every couple of decades when somebody works out that a quantity of paper has been sitting in a room with a heating system in it since the 1970s. That work is slow, dull, and enormously expensive. Boxes come out. Contents are checked against a schedule. Anything at risk goes into acid-free storage with a new reference number, and the old schedule gets updated. Anne was involved because she has been involved in that sort of thing for 40 years. She sits on the committees nobody wants to sit on. She reads the papers nobody reads. No glamour attaches to any of it and no photographs come out of it. And if there is one consistent feature of that woman's working life, it is that she takes on the jobs that require somebody to go through the pages line by line. And in the middle of that exercise, a box came out that did not match its own label. The label said Correspondence, Private Secretary General, with a date range spanning 2 years in the middle 90s. Inside, underneath, about 4 inches of exactly that, there was a smaller enclosure that had been placed at the bottom and had a different reference entirely. Here is why that matters, and it is the single most important administrative detail in this whole story. A mislabeled box in an archive is not lost. Losing something means it is gone. A mislabeled box is worse because the document is safe, catalogued, preserved, and completely invisible. Every search anybody ever runs comes back empty, and the search comes back empty honestly. Anybody asked whether such a thing existed would have said no, and would have been telling the truth as far as they knew it. That enclosure had been sitting in the wrong box for 27 years, in a temperature-controlled room, in perfect condition. Anne did not open it that day. She flagged it, had it logged properly, and had it brought to her at Gatcombe the following week, which is a thing she is entitled to do and which nobody questioned. Now here is where the story takes its first real turn, and it is not the turn most people expect. The letter was not written to her sons. Every version of this going round assumes a mother sitting down and writing to 2 boys to be opened when they were old enough, which is the thing people imagine, because it is the thing they would do themselves. That is not what she wrote. The letter was addressed to the woman who was, at that point, the most senior figure in that family, and it was written in the specific formal register a person uses when they are asking for something rather than confiding in somebody. Diana wrote to the Queen. She wrote to her mother-in-law in the summer of 1993, at the exact point when her marriage had collapsed publicly, when she had no legal position left inside that institution, and when everything about her future was being decided by people in rooms she was not in. And she did not ask for anything for herself. The whole letter concerns her children. I will come to the wording in a few minutes, and I am holding it deliberately, because it needs one more piece of context before it will do to anybody watching what it did to me. Because the second turn is this: it was answered. The reply was in the same enclosure, filed underneath it. A copy? Retained? As every reply out of that office has been retained since the 1800s. And the reply is not cold. That is the part that stopped me. There is a version of this story where a grieving family is confronted with an unfeeling institution, and I have told versions of that story on this channel more than once, and this is not one of them. The answer was warm, it was careful, it acknowledged what she had asked, and it said that the matter would be considered properly and that she would be spoken to about it. Somebody sat down and wrote that in good faith. And then the letter, and the reply, and the whole enclosure went into a box in the wrong sequence. And the conversation that was promised in that reply never happened, because 11 weeks later, something else entirely became the only thing anybody in that building was working on. Hold that timing, because I am going to come back to it, and it is the thing that turns an administrative accident into something much harder to look at. And there is one more thing in that enclosure that nobody has mentioned anywhere, which is a set of initials at the foot of the reply. Replies out of that office carry the drafting officer's initials in the bottom left corner. It is a housekeeping convention, and it has been done that way for a century, so that a file can always be traced back to the desk it came off. Those initials belong to a man who is now in his late 80s and who lives quietly in Hampshire. He is alive. He is entirely lucid. He has never given an interview in his life, and he is not going to start now. Anne went to see him before she did anything else with any of it, and she went on her own, in the afternoon, having telephoned first. Whatever was said in that house has stayed in it, and both of those people were raised in a world where it stays there permanently. The part that is known is that she came away with one piece of information that changed the character of the entire file. He remembered writing it, not vaguely. He remembered the letter arriving. He remembered what it asked for, and he remembered his own recommendation, which was that the request be put to Her Majesty properly rather than answered off the desk. He also remembered that he chased it, twice. That is the detail that took this from an accident to something with a shape, and it is the reason a woman in her 70s sat in a car outside a house in Hampshire for a few minutes before she started the engine. Somebody in that building had tried. Anne read both documents in one sitting at her own kitchen table. The person who was in the house that evening has described what happened afterwards in one sentence. She read them, she put them down, and she sat there for a long time without saying anything to anybody. That woman has been dealing with that family's paperwork since the 1960s. She has read wills, divorce settlements, medical arrangements, and things that will never be discussed anywhere. She had never seen this one. Now let me give you the timing, because the dates are what turn this from a filing error into something with a shape. The letter went in the summer of 1993. The reply followed within the month. Both of those sit in a period when that household was dealing with the aftermath of a separation that had been announced to Parliament the previous December, and when the question of what Diana's position would be had not been settled by anybody. She had no title of her own yet, in the sense that mattered. She had no household of her own. Her access to her sons during term time and at family occasions was being worked out arrangement by arrangement, and every one of those arrangements was being written down by somebody who worked for the other side of the marriage. That is the context she was writing in. A woman with no institutional standing, asking the one person in that family with the standing to decide something. And here is the mechanism that buried it, and this is the second and last technical thing I will put you through tonight. Correspondence into that office gets sorted by category before it gets sorted by importance. There is a category for heads of state. There is one for government. There is one for members of the family in an official capacity, and there is one for members of the family in a private capacity, and each of those categories has a different circulation list attached to it. Diana in 1993 sat in an awkward gap between two of those categories, and after the divorce in 1996 she moved permanently into the one used for former members. The consequence is the whole story. Once something is filed under former member, private, it stops circulating. It does not go up, it does not get reviewed annually. It sits correctly stored in a category that exists precisely so that things do not keep coming back. Nobody made a decision to bury that letter in 1993. I want to be extremely clear about that, because the easy version of this story has a villain in it in 1993, and I do not believe there was one. A letter arrived. It was read. It was answered honestly. Somebody intended to come back to it. And then the 31st of August 1997 happened, and every person in that building spent the following 2 years dealing with the largest institutional crisis of their working lives. And a box went back on a shelf with the wrong reference on it. That is not a conspiracy. That is a building full of exhausted people. That brings us to 2005, and to the part where it stops being an accident. In the spring of that year, Charles married Camilla, and a marriage at that level triggers an enormous amount of dull administrative work, because two households have to be merged into an arrangement that functions, and everything that sits in the older one has to be assigned to somebody. Legacy files get reviewed during that process. Every one of them. It is a formal exercise. It produces a schedule, and each item on that schedule gets a recommendation and a signature. The enclosure came up in that review. It came up correctly under its wrong label as part of a batch of items concerning the previous marriage, and somebody senior enough to make the recommendation looked at what was in that batch and had to decide what happened to each piece of it. The recommendation on that item was that the file remain closed and that no further circulation be undertaken. And the minute carries the sign off of the Duchess of Cornwall's office. Now, this is my reading rather than anybody's confirmed account, and I will say it once and then get out of the way. I do not think she read that letter and decided to hide it. I have gone round and round on this, and I keep landing in the same place. I think a woman 4 weeks into the most scrutinized marriage in Britain was handed a schedule of 47 legacy items concerning her husband's first wife. And I think she did the thing that anybody in her position, terrified of putting a foot wrong, would have done. She left everything exactly where it was and signed the form that said so. That is not villainy, that is self-preservation, and it is entirely understandable. It is also the reason two men in their 20s, who were at that point living through the aftermath of their mother's death in public for the 8th consecutive year, never received something she had written about them. Because here is the thing about a decision like that. It is completely defensible on the day it is made, and it becomes less defensible every single year afterwards. In 2005, it was a new wife being careful. By 2011, when William married, it was a family choice. By 2022, when she became queen, it was a woman with the standing to open any file in that building at any time she chose, who had known for 17 years that the item was there. And by the time Anne was sitting at a kitchen table in Gloucestershire with the thing in front of her, that minute had been sitting in a schedule for 20 years with a name on it. Somebody left a comment under one of my videos a while back that has stayed with me since, and it belongs here. They wrote that in that family nobody ever does the wrong thing, they only ever decline to do the right one. I thought that was a clever line at the time. Then I read the wording of a 2005 minute, which is 4 lines long, entirely correct, and closed the door on 2 grieving young men for another 2 decades. Now I owe you the wording. It is 1 page, on plain paper, and it asks for 2 things. The first is procedural, and it reads like nothing at all until the second one arrives. She asked that if anything ever happened to her, her sons be told what she wanted for them in her own words, by a person she named, rather than through the household. She was specific about it, not by a private secretary, not by anybody in an official capacity, by her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, who is a real person who was close to her, and who 4 years later would end up as one of the 2 executors of her estate, though nobody knew that in 1993. Diana wanted the message carried by family rather than by staff. That is the first request, and on its own it is almost administrative. Read it in 1993 and it looks like a woman being careful about a hypothetical. The second request is the reason I have been holding this for 20 minutes. She asked that her sons never be required to take part in any public act of mourning for her that they had not themselves chosen to take part in. Read that again slowly. 1993. 4 years before anything happened. A woman of 32, sitting at a desk with her marriage in pieces and her position inside that family being negotiated by other people. Writing to the Queen to ask that if she died, her 2 boys would not be put in front of the country to perform their grief unless they had decided to do it themselves. She did not know what was coming. Nobody did. She was thinking about a car accident or an illness in the abstract the way everybody does when they finally sit down and make a will. And she asked for the one thing she could think of that would protect them from the machine she had spent a decade inside. On the 6th of September 1997, William was 15 years old and Harry was 12, and both of them walked behind their mother's coffin through central London in front of a crowd that stretched for miles, and an estimated 2.5 billion people watching from indoors. Both of them have talked about that walk since. William has described how difficult it was and has said he does not think anybody should be asked to do the same. Harry has been considerably blunter about it in public more than once and has said plainly that he does not believe a child should be made to do that under any circumstances. For 29 years, the accepted account of that decision has been that the family debated it, that the grandfather offered to walk beside the boys, and that it was arrived at collectively in an impossible week with the whole world watching. And all of that is true. Every part of it happened, and the people involved were doing their best inside a catastrophe. The letter was in the building that week. Not in a vault in another county, not in a solicitor's office, in a box on a shelf, in an office in that same institution, 4 inches under a stack of general correspondence with the wrong reference number written on the lid. Nobody in the room where that decision was taken knew it existed. And that is the part that I cannot get past. And I have had this file for a while now. Nobody did anything wrong on that particular day. That is what makes it unbearable rather than infuriating. There was no villain in that room in September 1997. There was a family in shock, a country coming apart outside the gates, and a set of adults making the least bad decision they could see in front of about 800 cameras. The woman who had the answer had written it down 4 years earlier, and had been told in writing that it would be considered properly and that somebody would speak to her about it. Nobody ever did. And then she was gone, and the only 2 people that page was written to protect walked out through those gates behind her coffin, and the paper that said they should never have been asked to was 300 yards away in a box. Anne read that page at her kitchen table and understood inside about a minute what it was going to do to her nephew. Because that is the thing about this letter. It does not accuse anybody. It does not name anybody unkindly. There is nothing in it about Charles, nothing about the marriage, and nothing about anybody the newspapers would want it to be about. It is a mother asking in advance for 2 small things and being answered warmly and then being filed. The damage in it is therefore not aimed at a person at all. It is aimed at the thing everybody in that family has been quietly telling themselves for 29 years, which is that what happened to those boys in that week was unavoidable. The letter proves it was not. She had asked, in writing, 4 years before, and the request was sitting in the same building in the wrong box while the decision was being made. And there is one person still living who was named on that page and who never knew it. Lady Sarah McCorquodale is in her 80s. She was Diana's elder sister. She spent the years after 1997 as an executor of an estate she never asked to administer, taking public criticism for decisions she made in the worst period of her life, and she has never once answered any of it in print. She had no idea her sister had put her name in a letter to the Queen. She had spent 29 years believing that whatever her sister had wanted for those boys had died with her in a tunnel in Paris, because that is what everybody involved believed. Anne told her before she told anybody else in the family. The 2 of them are almost exactly the same age. They have known each other since the 1970s, and they have been on opposite sides of a great deal of history without ever once falling out about any of it in public. Nobody has described that conversation, and nobody is going to. The establishable part is that it took place in person, that it lasted most of an afternoon, and that Lady Sarah asked for a photocopy of 1 page and nothing else. She had been named to carry a message. She found out about it at 83. Anne kept it for 9 days before she did anything with it. I have thought about those 9 days more than any other part of this, because that woman is not somebody who sits on a document. She is famously the fastest decision maker in that family. Everybody who works near her says the same thing about her, which is that she reads a thing once and tells you what happens next before you have finished sitting down. 9 days. The thing she was working out, from everything I can establish, was not whether to show it to William. It was the order. She went to William first, and she went to him at his own house rather than at an office, in the early evening, having asked for 20 minutes and having declined to say what it was about. And here is the turn that I did not see coming when I started going through this, and which changes the whole complexion of it. He already half knew. Not the letter, not the wording, not the date, not the reply. But some years earlier, a retired member of staff who had worked in that building in the 90s had told him, in a private conversation, that they believed his mother had written to the Queen about him and his brother at some point before her death, and that they thought it had concerned the boys specifically. That person could not produce it. They had never seen it. They had heard about it once, at the time, in a corridor, from somebody else who is now dead. William did what anybody sane would do with that. He had a discreet search run. The search came back empty, honestly, because every search of that archive would come back empty for as long as that box carried the wrong reference on the lid, and he let it go. There was nothing else available to do with it. He had been carrying it for years as a thing he suspected and could not prove, and had eventually filed it in his own head under the category everybody in that family has, which is things I will never know for certain. And when his aunt put one page and one reply on the table in front of him, what he was looking at was not a discovery. It was a confirmation he had stopped expecting to get. The people who have described that evening have been careful, and I am going to be careful too, because there is a version of this where I tell you what a man said about his dead mother in his own sitting room, and I am not going to do that. The part that can be established is what he did afterwards, and he did 3 things in the following week. The first was to ask for the box, not a copy of the enclosure. The box with its wrong label still on it, and the shelving record showing where it had been standing since the 90s. The second was to ask for the 2005 review schedule. The whole thing, all 47 items, with every recommendation and every signature. And the third is the one that tells you everything about how that man has been operating since his father took the throne. He asked for the conservation program's publication timetable because a conservation program produces a report. That report goes into an annual return, and an annual return in that institution is a published document. Hold that, because it is the last turn in this story, and it is the one that ends it. Before any of that, though, there was the second decision, and it is the one that took him longer than the other 3 combined. Harry. The letter concerns 2 people equally. It names neither of them. It says "my sons" throughout. And there is no reading of that page on which one brother is entitled to it and the other is not. Everything about the last 6 years says that document should have sat in a drawer in England and stayed there. The books, the interviews, the legal actions, the years of things said in both directions that cannot be unsaid, all of it pointing at a family arrangement in which those 2 men communicate through lawyers and press offices when they communicate at all. And there is no version of this in which a man reads that page and does not tell his brother it exists. He did it himself. No intermediary, no private secretary, no message passed through anybody's office. They spoke on the telephone for something over an hour, which is longer than those 2 have spoken to each other in a very long time, and neither of them has said one word about it in public since, and I do not expect either of them ever will. I can tell you what that page would have meant to the younger one specifically, and this is the part the coverage keeps missing. William has spent 29 years being told his mother's memory is safe with the institution. Harry has spent the same 29 years saying, publicly and at enormous personal cost, that it was not, and being described for his trouble as bitter, unstable and disloyal by roughly half of this country. That page is the first piece of paper in 3 decades that supports his account rather than the household's, his mother asked. She was told it would be considered. Nobody came back to her. And 2 children were put in front of a global audience to perform a grief that one of them has been saying should never have been asked of him since the day he was old enough to say it. He has been telling that story without evidence for 6 years. Somebody found the evidence in a mislabeled box, and the person who found it was a 76-year-old woman who has spent her entire life being described as the last person in that family who would ever take his side about anything. There is one more thing about that decision, and it is the part I keep turning over. She could have had it sent. There is an entire apparatus for exactly that, and using it would have put a private secretary's name on the covering note instead of hers, and would have given her deniability for the rest of her life about whether she had personally chosen to hand a document like that to the person she handed it to. She did not use the apparatus. She sent him a copy. And I keep coming back to that detail because everything Anne has ever done in public says she should not have. She is the institution. She is the one who never breaks ranks, never comments, never gives anybody anything. She sent it anyway, and she did it before she took it to the king. The king saw it 11 days after his son did, and the order of that is not an accident either. Anne took it to him herself, at Windsor, with no aides in the room, which is exactly how she handled the other file I have covered on this channel, and which appears to be the only way that woman does anything difficult. He read the letter first and the reply second, and then he asked for the 2005 schedule, which is the same document his son had asked for 11 days earlier, and neither of them knew the other had asked. The people around him that week have described the same thing everybody describes about that man under pressure, which is that he went very quiet and kept his diary. He did not defend the 2005 minute. There was nothing available to defend. He did not attempt to explain his wife's signature, and by every account he never once raised the subject of her at all during that conversation. He asked about 1993 instead. He wanted to know who had answered it and whether that person was still alive. And when Anne told him the man was living in Hampshire and had remembered chasing it twice, the king put the page down and did not pick it up again. His first wife had written to his mother about their children, and a member of his own household had tried twice to get it in front of somebody, and it had gone into a box. Nobody had to say anything to him about any of that. He had been the Prince of Wales in that building in 1993, and the question of what he had known then, if anything, is one that nobody in that family has put to him, and nobody ever will. Now the last turn, and it is the reason none of this could be contained. Conservation programs publish. That is not a leak, and it is not a briefing. It is a legal and administrative fact about how that institution accounts for what it holds. A private archive gets reviewed, and the work produces a report. The report lists what was found, what condition it was in, what was recatalogued, and what reference numbers changed. That report goes into an annual return, and that return is published because an institution that holds material of national significance has to be able to demonstrate what it has and how it is looking after it. Nobody reads those documents. They run to 140 pages of shelving codes. 3 lines in that year's return recorded that one enclosure had been found stored under an incorrect reference, had been recatalogued, and gave the date range of the original filing. And in the appendix, as the format requires, the return listed the prior administrative history of the item, including a 2005 review, its recommendation, and the office that signed it. There is no name in that appendix. Offices are named, not people. It says the recommendation was made under the authority of the household of the Duchess of Cornwall, which is what that office was called in 2005, and which everybody in this country can translate inside a second. The palace did not release that. Nobody chose that moment. A conservation team in a basement filled in a form correctly, and the form went into a document that gets published every year, and the whole thing was in the public domain for 11 days before a single journalist noticed it, then one did. And the story that ran was not about a scandal, which is precisely why it could not be answered. It was about an archive. 3 lines and an appendix entry, reproduced exactly, with no allegation attached to any of it, because none was needed. 11 days is the detail that finished any chance of managing it. If a document appears in a published return, and somebody at the palace spots it within a day, there is a route available. A correction can be issued. A wording can be revised in the next edition. Somebody rings 2 editors and explains that an appendix entry has been misread. 11 days is too long. By the time anybody senior looked at it, that return had been downloaded, screenshotted, and posted in 3 countries. The palace said nothing, and there was nothing available to say. The document was theirs. They had published it themselves, and the second consequence of that publication is one nobody planned for at all. The return names the 17, not by name, because the format does not permit it, but it records that the 1993 material concerned dispositions to godchildren as well as to the sons, and that was enough. 2 of those godchildren are now in their 40s and have spent their adult lives being asked at dinner parties what they were left by Diana, and having to say out loud that they received a single item after having been told for a year that they were receiving a quarter of her personal property. One of them spoke on the record for the first time in 28 years. Not about the money, about the wording, about the fact that a woman wrote down what she wanted and the system decided that she had used the wrong verb, and that everybody involved in that decision has been publicly thanked for their service since. Camilla was not accused of anything, and she still has not been, and that is worth saying clearly because it is the difference between this and every other story about her. She did not hide that letter. She did not know about it in 1997 and had no connection to that family's paperwork for another 8 years. Everything she is on the record for doing is signing a routine recommendation, 4 weeks into a marriage, on a schedule of 47 items, that everything stay where it was. That is all. And it finished her anyway because of what she had spent the previous 20 years building. The entire second half of that woman's public life has rested on one carefully constructed position, which is that she is not a threat to Diana's memory. That is the thing that made the coronation possible. That is the argument every supportive profile has made about her since 2005. She waited, she was respectful, she never touched any of it. An appendix entry in a conservation return put her office's authority on a document that kept Diana's own handwriting away from Diana's sons for a further 17 years. Nothing in that sentence is an accusation, and every part of it is a fact. The box has a new reference now. It is in the published catalogue, and anybody in this country can look that reference up in about 4 minutes and see the description, the date range, and the storage class. The contents are not available and never will be. The enclosure is listed as restricted. Family with no review date attached to it, which in that catalogue means indefinitely. The object at the center of all of this is now a line in a public database that tells the entire country exactly where it is and confirms that they will never read it. Her patronages connected to Diana's causes moved within a month. Nobody announced it. The organizations were told there had been a reallocation among working members of the family, and each of them said the correct things about being grateful for her support. There was one evening in the middle of it that everybody who was there has described the same way. An anniversary reception for one of those organizations, arranged months in advance with her name on the original program. The program had been reprinted. She attended because withdrawing would have been a story, and she stood in a room of about 200 people holding a glass while somebody else stood at the lectern and spoke for 6 minutes about what Diana had meant to that charity. 2 of the people who came over were women she has known for 40 years, and both of them did the thing that people do in that situation, which is to talk with great warmth about something else entirely for 4 minutes and then move away. Nobody was unkind to her. Several people made a point of coming over. She stood at the side of a room and listened to somebody else say those things, and the photographs from that evening show a woman doing the hardest piece of work she has ever had to do in public, which is standing still with an appropriate expression. That is the whole punishment, and no palace issued any part of it. Tell me below what you would have done with that page in 2005, because I have gone round and round on it, and honestly I am not certain I would have opened it either in her position, and subscribe if you want the rest of these. Because the 2005 schedule ran to 47 items and only one of them has been through a conservation review so far. Diana wrote her will on the 1st of June 1993, and her letter of wishes on the 2nd. And a court later set that letter aside because she had written the word wishes instead of the word must. She wrote one more page that week, asking for 2 things for her children, and a family answered her kindly and then lost it in a box. 27 years later, a woman in her 70s found it during a job nobody wanted to do, and sent a copy to California before she took it to a king. Camilla spent 30 years making absolutely certain that she never once reached for anything of Diana's, and she built her entire position on the strength of it. And she lost that position without ever touching a single thing, on the strength of 4 lines she signed in the spring of 2005. When she had a letter from a dead woman in front of her, about 2 boys she was about to become a stepmother to, and decided that the safest thing she could possibly do was leave it exactly where it was.